Thank you. It's good to see you all tonight. I've seen and heard many good and famous writers over the years, but seldom have I been in the presence of an indisputable voice of his age. Of course, an age isn't what it once was. Well, with the internet, an age is down to a few years or maybe a few minutes. But when John Barth was leading the witty, brainy charge against modernism in the 1960s and 1970s, an age had shrunk to only 10 or 20 years. And he made the most of his time on the stage. In novels and story collections such as Giles Goat Boy, Lost in the Funhouse, and Chimera, winner of the 1973 National Book Award, Barth's postmodernism did just what a good iconoclastic literary movement is supposed to do. It challenged the previously dominant literary forms by not only showing how played out they were, but also by engaging them in a kind of conversation. And in the process, he created a lasting new literature, one that continues to influence younger writers in this new millennium. Of course, no movement lasts forever. By the mid-1980s, postmodernism had been shouldered aside by the stern neo-realism of Raymond Carver and the Lilliputian minimalists who came after him. Yet Barth remained faithful to his calling, sitting down with pen and paper every day, producing a regular output of novels, short stories, and essays. And let me just say, he's written all of his great books with pen and paper. And in honor of John Barth, I wrote my notes in order, which is part of why I'm having a hard time reading them. I admit when Barth's collection of stories, The Development, landed on my desk in 2008, my first reaction was, he's still alive? Not only was he still upright and breathing, so was his muse. The old Chimera, I soon saw, still had bite, just as she had 35 years ago when I read Barth for the first time. Now, however, at 81, Barth has reached something like the end of the road. Or has he? In his latest essay, which you can find in the winter issue of Granta magazine, he writes about the long wait for the muse to return following the publication of his most recent novel, Every Third Thought, which came out last summer. Judge for yourself as Mr. Barth reads his essay to us tonight, whether it is an elegy or perhaps a pause. But keep in mind the title, The End, includes a question mark. And now, thanks to Granta magazine and Books and Books, I'll give you one of the greatest writers you will ever have the privilege to see with your own eyes, John Barth.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Granta magazine, a lovely magazine. If you're not a fan of Granta, I hope you will become one. It's a splendid magazine, comes out of England. And to the Books and Books bookstore, this handsome place, for sponsoring this event, and to Chauncey Mabe for agreeing to share the platform with me. Can you hear me?
Maybe the microphone.
Chauncey, just move the mic close.
Yes.
How's that? A little better?
Yes.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you. Before I read this terminal sounding little essay called The End, which will require all of 6 or 7 minutes to read, I want to call your attention, as Chauncey's already done, to the question mark after the title. It's The End with a question mark, and to the fact that, in fact, when it appears in my next collection of essays called Final Fridays, which will be out in a couple of months, it has a subtitle which Granta didn't have room to put in, called On Writing No Further Fiction, Probably. So in short, I'm leaving the door ajar. I'm not closing the door. This is the essay, which if essays could be dedicated the way books can be dedicated, I'd be dedicating this essay to my wife, my critic of first resort, my sine qua non, Shelley, who had other commitments tonight and wasn't here, they would be here for the reading. So here's a little essay called The End, on Writing No Further Fiction, Probably. In 2011 and 2012, Two new products of this pen, a novel entitled Every Third Thought, which, as Chauncey said, is out already, and an essay collection entitled Final Fridays are scheduled for publication. Both were completed in 2009, my 80th year of life and 53rd as a publishing writer. At the time of their completion, I didn't think of them as my last books, only as the latest. But in the time since, although I've still gone to my workroom every weekday morning for decades, for the hours between breakfast and lunch that I've done for decades, and have faithfully reenacted my music-writing ritual, I find that I've written nothing. That room is divided into three distinct areas. Composition, one side of a large work table reserved for longhand first drafts of fiction on Mondays through Thursdays and nonfiction on Fridays, with supply drawers and adjacent reference bookshelves. Production, computer hutch with desktop word processor and printer for subsequent drafts and revisions. And business, other side of work table with desk calendar and office files. As for the ritual, step one is to seat myself at the composition table, set down my refilled thermal mug of breakfast coffee, and insert the wax earplugs that I got in the habit of using back in the 1950s when my three children, who are now in their 50s, were rambunctious toddlers and became so associated with my sentence making that even as a long-time empty nester in a quiet house, I continued to feel the need for them. I can't imagine the muse beginning to speak until I've shut out any other As for the ritual, okay, done that, insert the three, insert the wax earplugs. Step two is to open the stained and battered 3-ring loose leaf binder, now 63 years old and held precariously together with strapping tape that I bought during my freshman orientation week at Johns Hopkins University in 1947, and in which I penned all my undergraduate and grad school class notes, professorial lecture drafts during my decades in academia, and first drafts and entire corpus of my fiction and nonfiction. I wish I could have brought it with you to show you this, really, but I'm afraid it will fall apart in transit, so I leave it on my work desk. But that business of opening that particular notebook, which the corners are all worn off from my thumb turning it ever since my freshman year at Hopkins in 47. Step three is to unclip from that binder's middle ring the British Parker 51 fountain pen bought during my maiden tour of Europe in 1963-64 in a Volkswagen camper with those three then small children and their mother at a Rochester stationer's alleged to be the original of Mr. Pumblechook's premises in Dickens's Great Expectations, the pen with which I have penned every subsequent sentence, including this one, and which I still use every morning to pen my prose. Its predecessor, and also much valued Schaefer, that had seen me through college and my first 3 published novels, had been inadvertently cracked in my shirt pocket a few weeks earlier when I leaned against a battlement in Hamlet's castle in Elsinore, Danish Helsingør near Copenhagen, the northernmost stop of that makeshift grand tour, in order to get a better view of Sweden across the water. I leaned across the battlement, heard a crack, saw a black burb on my jacket, and there went the Schaefer that had seen me through my first 3 novels. So the Parker came afterwards, my Brit Parker, which is even on the cover of one of my books. I value it so much. Which in happier days, step 4, meant reviewing and editing either the printouts of yesterday's first draft pages left off when the going was good, which Hemingway used to do, which so many novelists in particular do, and thus more readily resume the next day, or work notes toward some project in gestation, to be followed by step 5, re-inspiration and the composition of new sentences, paragraphs, and pages. I used to like to remind my graduate student that inspiration literally means breathing into. It's a kind of CPR from the muse, which we all need before we can get some work done. Of late, however, step 4 has consisted of staring vainly, pen in hand, at blank ruled pages, or exchanging fountain pen for note-taking ballpoint. Never take notes with the same pen that you write prose sentences with. creative writing sentences with, and perusing for possible suggestions either my spiral brown work notebook number 5, 2008 hyphen blank, or my little black 6-ring loose leaf personal notebook diary to no avail. That latter, the diary, has only a few blank leaves remaining and no room for more, and the workroom's bookshelves reserved for one copy of each edition and translation of every book, magazine article, and anthology contribution that I've ever perpetrated are already crowded beyond their capacity, with new editions lying horizontally across older ones and jammed into crannies between bookcase and wall. That almost exhausted notebook space, those overflowing shelves, are they trying to tell me something? I plug my ears, strain not to listen. Like most fiction writers of my acquaintance, perhaps especially those who mainly write novels rather than short stories, I'm accustomed to a well-filling interval of some weeks or even months between book-length projects, an interval not to be confused with writer's block. Indeed, I've learned to look forward to that bit of respite from sentence making after a new book has left the shop. Bulky typescript, both snail-mailed nowadays and emailed to agent and thence to publisher, and to busy making notes toward the next one while final copy editing and galley proofing its predecessor. This time, however, ... Well, a writer friend of mine from Kansas who knows about water wells informs me of the important distinction between dry wells and gurglers, which may cease producing for a time, but eventually resume. He encourages me to believe that I am, if no longer a geyser, still a gurgler, not yet a mere geezer. May that prove to be the case, but if in fact the well is dry, I remind myself that as we've aged, my wife and I have been obliged to put other much enjoyed pleasures behind us: snow skiing, water skiing, tennis, sailboat cruising on the Chesapeake, and yes, even vigorous youthful sex, but certainly not love and intimacy. And as someone once wisely reserved, some New Yorker, as I remember, sex goes, memory goes, but the memory of sex, that never goes. If my vocation, my calling, turns out to have joined that sigh and smile list of once upon a times, its memory will be a cherished one indeed. Time will tell. Meanwhile, maybe write a little piece about not writing? Thank you.
Okay, let's take a vote. Who thinks that was it? We'll never hear from John Barth again. Well, it's really an honor to have you with us tonight, Mr. Barth. And I have some questions here to get this gurgler going. So was that the end? What's your opinion?
Well, it's important to remember that there is a question mark after it, and I have that subtitle on it, leaving the door ajar and not closed. I've been making notes toward making notes, let me put it that way, and looking at notebook notes that I've made from years past, sometimes decades past, to see whether over the passage of time they might suggest something to me now that they didn't at the time. So far they haven't, and yet please understand, I'm not closing the door. I'm not talking despair. At my age, one either has run out of patience, or one learns to be very patient. And in that department, at least, I've learned to be very patient. I still enjoy, I can't imagine otherwise, I still enjoy, as I think I just mentioned, going to that desk, those motions, even the physical motions, as some of you may know from your own professions and vocations, the physical motions of going to the workplace, going through the preparatory rituals and so forth, themselves are a pleasure. And I find, and I still, will not leave that place until 11:30, 11:45, lunchtime, which is when I always used to quit anyhow. That's still such a pleasure, even if nothing comes from it. So, I make little notes about things. I've written a few Zen koans, folk I don't think any Zen master would recognize him as a legitimate koan. And other little notes toward notes toward notes and so forth. If that's the way it is, that's the way it is. But of course, my hope is that the muse is that the bitch will come out of hibernation, and that sweet lady will once again see fit to breathe into my spirit what it takes to write new fiction. The mere physical act, as I mentioned before, what Ann Tyler used to call the muscular cursive of writing with pen on paper. Of course, I depend on the word processor for all subsequent drafts and editing. It's a wonderful invention for that. But that flow of ink on paper, I miss so much that sometimes I will just take my pen and write ink on paper, or anything. Look, dear pen, you're still working. So that's to keep it going.
If the fictive muse remains coy, would you take consolation in writing nonfiction?
Well, as I've told you, my habit for decades has been fiction on Monday through Thursdays and nonfiction on Fridays. The End, that essay that I just read, was a Friday product, and I've been making notes towards some further essays since, and I'll be pleased to see that new collection, Final Fridays with a question mark, come out later this month. Oh, sure, I'd be content to be, I'd much rather be writing, as I'm so used to doing, fiction most of the time, and nonfiction as a kind of respite and change of media, or genres, I should say, for certain.
When I spoke to you on the phone and we were on this subject, you said something about that led me to infer that you consider that your work is the work of constructing sentence.
I always think of it that way, of constructing sentences, those units of which all prose is made, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, and that business of starting a sentence, coming to a period, actually putting the period down, which is much more fun with a pen than it is hitting a key on a typewriter, and then going to the next one, and the flow of the next words and so forth, is certainly a delight. I should mention that before I decided that my vocation, muse helped me, is in the writing of fiction, my ambition all through high school years, I had played jazz in a jazz band, jazz combo, to help make extra money when I was in high school, and then when I went to college, to help pay my way through college, I played in better and better jazz groups as I got to be a little by myself. I was a drummer in what in those days was called an arranger, an orchestrator, in other words. I'd gone up to Juilliard after high school in hopes that that's what I could do, and found in Juilliard in 2 weeks in their summer program what I've seen some of my writing students realize halfway through the semester, that while the person over here and the person over here might be going to be the musicians of their generation, I had to look for something else to do. That what I had hoped was a pre-professional vocation with an amateur flair. And it's good to recognize that, and particularly if you can find something else that turns out to be your vocation. But with playing music and arranging music, which I also took very seriously, I loved doing it. But when I found out that had come to a stop, I continued to play jazz right through a number of my professorial years, first to help implement my lower rank income, and then just for the pleasure of playing at each other's houses. But a time came when that too, I found that my reflexes were getting slower. To play drums particularly, you need fairly fast reflexes. And I realized I wasn't doing it as well as I liked. So I had to set it aside, and I mentioned, as one has to set other things aside that you've enjoyed and actually been rather good at. Now, writing is a different story because I remind myself, and I've probably said more than once, that Sophocles was supposed to have written Oedipus at Colonos, the last of his Theban trilogy, at age 90. And here I am only age 81. I'm hoping there may be another story or two, maybe even another book in the works. Time will tell.
Your first 2 or 3 novels were